Hi, Martha Nussbaum students. This is Dan, and I'm trying out an experiment, and I hope it works. What I'm doing is doing a home video mini lecture of what we covered on Monday for Martha Nussbaum, Class 9, based on the now quite ominously titled Hiding from Humanity. Just before I get into it, I just wish you all well at the moment. I wish you and your loved ones well. I hope you're well. I hope you're keeping safe. I'm thinking of you all. And I hope over the next few weeks, what we can try and do is I'll send out these lectures on Moodle, and we can try a couple of things of having discussions around them. I mean, they're not going to make up for our fabulous discussions at the Mary Ward Centre. But I wonder if we can try a couple of things out. One, using online discussion forums, and then another, I don't know if this will work well, like a live online webinar, they're called, where we try and all Skype in. I'll say more about that probably later. I need to try some things out. Anyway, so, and just to kind of make this a bit, I don't know, a bit more real, this is me at home. Yeah, everyone home for me as well at the moment, touch wood. And you can see, not deliberately, a poster of Brave New World behind me. Should we talk about that? I don't know. All right, let's talk about Martha Nussbaum. Okay, so for the rest of this, you're going to see slides. So here is Hiding from Humanity. And I thought we could start with this. This is a wonderful image by Vincent van Gogh. It's an almond tree blossoming. You'll notice the rich blue, you'll notice the colours. Maybe you might see here a Japanese influence. Some of you might know with Van Gogh that he was very interested in Japanese art. But the almonds also mean something else for him. He does a lot of these paintings towards the end of his life, and the almonds in particular were meant to represent hope, awakening. This one was a gift to his brother, Theo, on the birth of his nephew. So it's about birth and joy in the flowering and possibilities and renewal of life. But us Martha Nussbaum heads, we will also be thinking, what else does a plant mean? Well, you'll remember, of course, from the Fragility of Goodness in the early weeks of our course, that Martha Nussbaum traces a view of human life to two different objects, and it sounds like quite a strange distinction. You've got the vine from the poet Pindar, and you've got the gem, which is kind of from Immanuel Kant. Now, when Martha Nussbaum is talking about the vine, it's about the fragility or the vulnerability of human life. That all of us are interdependent, all of us come into the world as we're born needy, dependent on others, but this relationship remains throughout our life. And it's something that we mustn't lose track of, because especially in philosophy, we strive for a condition, understandably, of self-sufficiency, of not being vulnerable to others, because that means we're vulnerable to being harmed and to being hurt and to being let down in different ways. The philosopher strives to not be dependent on these fickle and transient objects. The philosopher, in the manner of Spinoza, looks for a true and perfect good. And that classic philosophy only comes through the contemplation of the infinite. Of course, we get this in Plato as well. We get this when we think about Socrates early on in our class. A good man cannot be harmed. What a wonderful thought. That there's something about philosophy and contemplation of the infinite that it allows us to think about what outlives the human body. These eternal, infinite truths. Now, all of this is wonderful. It's great stuff. But Nussbaum's point is that these dreams of the philosophers mean that we neglect what also really matters for human life. And that is our relationships with people around us. That is our own mortality, our own fragility. And if we can't see that, then what can we see? So I think this is an interesting one to think about at the moment. I also picked out a quotation from Rousseau. Well, I didn't pick it out, Martha Nussbaum did. It comes from the beginning of this book, Hiding from Humanity, and I think it's really striking. I'm going to read it to you, but we're going to go through it in little parts. This is Rousseau writing in the book Emile, which is a guide to education, and it's one which Mary Wollstonecraft really savages because of its rather derogatory view of women in this. But if we overlook that stuff and think about something quite beautiful and interesting, it's this sentiment. So we'll go through it. And it's about human life. Human beings are not by nature kings or lords or courtiers or rich. All are born naked and poor. All are subject to the miseries of life, to sorrows, ills, needs, and pains of every kind. Finally, all are condemned to death. It is the weakness of the human being that makes us sociable. It is our common miseries that turn our hearts to humanity. We would owe humanity nothing if we were not human. Now that's quite a striking formulation, the way that Rousseau reworks it. It's our weakness that makes us strong. It is our misery that makes us love. He continues. Every attachment is a sign of insufficiency. If each of us had no need of others, he would hardly think of uniting himself with them. Now we know when we think about our philosophers like Plato or Kant or Spinoza, that attachment is something risky, it's something dangerous. We're insufficient. We are vulnerable to our emotions and desires. We're vulnerable to delusions. We're vulnerable to greed. We're vulnerable to being hurt. The philosopher, quite rightly, wants to protect us from hurt. But Rousseau's point here is if we protect ourselves from hurt, if we shield ourselves from others, then we miss out on something that's really deep and important and rich to human life. Thus, from our weakness, our fragile happiness is born. Now, this next bit is also quite striking from Rousseau. I do not conceive how someone who needs nothing can love anything. I do not conceive how someone who loves nothing can be happy. So whereas some of our Stoics, some of our classic philosophers want to extract us from what harms us by allowing us to contemplate something which is much more majestic, Rousseau's point is, hold on. This weakness is our strength. This weakness, this incompleteness gives us a capacity to love, to care. Let's not try and strip ourselves of that too soon. In some ways, it is the most important thing we can experience. So, what does that all mean for Martha Nussbaum? So this quote here begins at the very beginning of the book, Hiding from Humanity, Disgust, Shame, and the Law. Now, this is an interesting book. I don't know what you thought of the reading. We can talk about this a bit later. This book maybe hasn't got the sense of like flow and breadth and heart in some ways that some of those earlier wonderful books like The Fragility of Goodness or Love's Knowledge or The Therapy of Desire had. But still, there are some very powerful and interesting things here. It's a book from 2004. It's a book that is in places quite academic, and we know if we put it into a kind of context, this is Martha Nussbaum writing as a legal academic because she's denied tenure at Harvard, and then she moves to Brown, and then she ends up at Chicago, and so much of her later career is in teaching law, teaching trainee lawyers. So this partly has a basis for thinking about this book. But there's something else important here, and we can pitch this around the question that Martha Nussbaum sets in this book quite early on. Shame, I quote, shame and disgust are prominent in the law as they are in our daily lives. How do and how should they figure in law's formulation and administration? Okay, well, on one level, this is quite straightforward. Nussbaum is saying that shame and disgust are a deep part of the human condition. They're part of how we make judgments for good or for ill. Okay. But what does that then mean in a legal context, and what does that then mean in a political context? And this is what the book is trying to explore. So what I will do, and it's going to be an interesting format for me because I'm used to you guys all interrupting and asking me questions. So I've kind of got the mic for quite a long time here. I'm going to tell you the structure, and I think this talk, I don't know, I think this is going to be like a 20-minute talk. I'm going to talk a bit about shame and guilt in a broader context. Then we're going to look at Nussbaum's specific arguments, I'm going to set you some questions to think about. We're going to think about why Nussbaum is trying to present disgust and shame in terms of a liberal internationalist standpoint, which I think she's been developing over the course. And then we're going to put this into a political context. We're going to talk about Donald Trump, and we're going to talk about cosmopolitanism. I hope this will cheer you up. We're going to try and end on something stirring and positive, and then that'll be that. All right, so let's talk about shame in a broader context, first of all. And for this material, I decided to kind of not really look in Nussbaum, but to kind of look more broadly at how shame and disgust are contextualized and explained. So, shame. I want you to think for a moment about shame, about how people are shamed. Instances of where people are shamed for doing the wrong thing or being the wrong kind of person in different ways. I want you to see if you can think of one or two examples. Now, there are a lot of examples that we could consider. I'm going to give some that are American, and then I'm going to give you a British one, and this might kind of get you thinking about this as well. Also, there's an interesting thing about what shame really means. So, in this, what you'll see in front of you is a poster from a hospital trust in Atlanta, in the American state of Georgia. Now, these are posters targeted at the parents of children with obesity. Now, you can see the 3 children in front of you. I don't know how old they are. Maybe they're like 11 or 12. And you can see these messages on the left. Admit the problem and you can help him change. It hurts to admit he's fat. It hurts more to ignore it. Obese is only a bad word if you ignore it. So I guess the context here is fat shaming. But we might be wondering, are these posters fair? Because these are real children here, aren't they? There's a good ethos behind this, that we want parents to not take for granted that their children are obese and therefore going to develop health problems later. But is shaming these children the right way to do it? Perhaps not. Enough in front of you, flight shame. Now, I don't know how much this applies to many of you. I don't know if many of us really fly. We won't be flying much for the next few months. This comes from a Swedish concept of flygskam, or flight shame. Now, this relates to a BBC piece from late last year. Now, on one hand, this is about people not flying as much for environmental reasons, but the flight shaming aspect is people being shamed on social media or among their peers for taking flights, short haul flights or what have you. Now, the concern of air companies is that this is going to halve air traffic. I don't know. Is it flight shaming? Okay, let me give you enough one, but this is more general. Maybe it's more relevant than all of these. The Daily Telegraph, of course, what a good source. Online shaming. Now, this does have a bearing in politics. When people look on the social media profiles of aspiring politicians and find that in 2012 on MySpace, on Twitter at 3 in the morning, on Facebook, commenting to a friend, they said something a little bit rude, a bit regrettable. Now, what is then used, I can't give you any examples, but you might think of some, is that this kind of rude message is then distributed everywhere as a way of shaming that person and making out that they are unfit for public life because they hold bad views. Now, on the political right in the UK, this has become a bit of an issue with free speech in universities and the alarm about cancelling or no platforming controversial speakers. It's been an interesting one for universities because they're considered to be bastions of the left and therefore we might suppose liberalism. But if these universities are cancelling contentious speakers who might hold, views that are not de rigueur about, trans rights or about immigration, then they're cancelled. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is that this is something that we often read about in the Times or the Telegraph, but it is quite rare. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it does. So what does that mean when we think about how somebody is shamed, how the dirt is dug up? This did come up recently. Now I can give you an example. This is one that I discussed in our class on Monday. Some of you who weren't there might be thinking, did anybody actually come? A small number of people did. I thought of the example, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong because I can't remember his surname exactly, of Andrew Sabitsky, one of Dominic Cummings' recent hires. One of the weirdos that responded to that job advert. Now, Sabitsky, it was found that he'd kind of written some pieces semi-publicly about eugenics, and all of this stuff was publicized everywhere, and he was very quickly sacked. Now, eugenics, of course, is very worrying. It's quite, and it's alarming that this kind of pseudoscience from the late 19th century has had a resurgence. Now, Sabitsky lost his job, but because of the public shame around him and his fairly memorable name, I suppose, it's unlikely that he's ever going to get a job in public life anytime soon. Is that fair for holding disgusting views, holding reprehensible views? Through a friend of a friend, I heard that Sabitsky has got a wife and a young child, and there was a discussion among our friends, about what that would mean for him. You know, of course, his views are completely unacceptable. But what will it mean for him thereafter? He's been shamed for not holding the right views. Those are terrible views that he holds. But what next? Trial by public media. Is there a risk with shaming people in this way? I'm going to give you some more examples. Now, more broadly, and this one might be an issue in which this can stir us more in the right direction, is social class and how people might be shamed for not looking the right way, not eating the right food. Or you might have thought this earlier with obesity. Maybe obesity is a bit of a class thing, that it's more working class people that are going to be obese, or their children are. Now, in the UK, where you could think of Vicky Pollard from Little Britain. Yeah, it's a bit of an outdated example, but here is a character that is mocking some kind of a teenage girl who lives on a council estate, who speaks funny. Yeah, but no, but. And it riffs on certain ideas that have been circulating in the right-wing press about scrounging single mothers living on sink council estates, having lots of children and not being very bright. We can see this with the number of babies of obvious different fathers in the prams. Now, this became of interest. Owen Jones, before he became famous, wrote a book called Chavs. Some of you might have read this, about the demonization of the working class. Chavs isn't a term that we hear much nowadays, but there were websites like Chav Scum, Shit Towns was another, Chaviness, and Burberry clothes being all a part of this. Again, what we're getting here is a kind of shaming based on how you look, how you speak, how you dress. Do we want to put this in the category of shame? Being ashamed of where you're from? We're seeing that shame plays out in different ways. But let's think about the role of shame, because maybe shame is actually quite useful for justice. Maybe if we shame somebody, they're not going to want to do that bad thing again. Maybe Andrew Sabitsky is going to become a progressive non-eugenicist after this. Now, that logic is certainly in place when we think about justice in the medieval world. To be pilloried, to be put in the stocks. This is one of these Google images that I've found. The image looks like it's from a children's book from the mid-20th century. But we can see a medieval man, early modern. We can imagine him being pelted with fruit because he has stolen something or generally been a bit naughty. Now, surely this form of justice will be useful. On one level, it enables the community to release their anger on the wrongdoer. They can punish him in the stocks in this way, which is good for them. Also, it might deter this man from not doing the bad thing again. Maybe. So one way that we can think about this is, retributive justice. That justice is given through retribution. Now, this could be encapsulated, and something interesting is going to come up here, in the phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Also in the way that we think about life or nature as being necessarily cruel and aggressive, that we live in a dog-eat-dog world. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, the life of man in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish and short. In some, there's something cruel and aggressive about nature, about human life, and we've just got to wise up and face it. When somebody harms us, we have a right to harm them back. Now, that's not quite right, is it? Now, an eye for an eye, this is a very interesting one because I didn't know this. And John, who's in our class, made a brilliant point that we need to think about this. And I hope, John, I'm going to do this justice, this great contribution that you made in class. That we need to think about this phrase, eye for an eye, in context. Now, when it's given in scripture, it is not saying that we have a right to take someone's eye. Rather, the point is that if we harm someone, then ultimately we must be expected to compensate them. So if we take someone's eye, if we take someone's hands, we must kind of make up for that by giving them an eye, giving them a hand, by maybe in some ways restoring their rights or making sure they still have some capability. I shouldn't use that term, some capacity, rather afterwards. It's not about lashing out. Rather, if we harm, then we need to make sure that they can still live in some way. They can still be able to see or have some support afterwards. I'm not sure I've done this justice. So if you're listening to this, maybe just Google the real meaning of an eye for an eye. Now, dog eat dog world. I'm on stronger ground here. This is from Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare's point is not that dogs eat. Now, we're all out for each other. Watch your backs. Somebody will stab you and rob you if you're not careful. A dog eat dog world is a crazy world. It's a world in which their natural rules have been completely upended. Because dogs don't eat dogs. Dogs are eminently sociable creatures, as some of us will know. Dogs are very friendly to other dogs. And so the idea that a dog would eat another dog is unthinkable. Shakespeare's point is not that what nature is cruel, but actually the opposite. That in nature we are sociable and kind and cooperative. And it's in very unusual circumstances that those rules are ended. So keep this in mind. There's a cartoon in front of you. We want to end suffering through violence by using violence to make you suffer. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. There's enough way of thinking about this. So when we think about justice, we have retributive, and another way of thinking about it is restorative justice. That when wrongdoing occurs, when harm is done, the justice system shouldn't be about punishing and giving out very long jail sentences. Actually, instead, it should be trying to restore or rebalance the harm that's happened. And there's lots of ways that this can be done. So in the UK, the CPS talks about victim-offender mediation. That what we need to do is bring the two sides together, and the offender should apologise to the victim. And not only that, they can talk about ways to make it up to the victim. It's a way of bringing psychological closure, but it's also a way in which the victim might feel that some real justice is done. Now, in the class, an interesting point came up from Holger of when we think about people doing community service. Now, some of you might have seen people doing this in your local park, and in a lot of cases, the teams of people doing it are usually wearing, I don't know, like tabards or other things that make it clear that they're on community service. Now, is it right in those situations that it's publicly visible that they're doing this restorative work, or should it be a more private thing? Anyway, these are just British aspects, and what Martha Nussbaum talks about in the book is American aspects. The shaming of drunk drivers. So you can see in front of you two different number plates, and you see the one on the bottom right of Ohio, and then the one on the top left, I'm not sure what state that is, sorry. But they're in red, and red is a signal that these are drunk drivers, or they have been drunk when driving. So Nussbaum gives this as one example. She talks about the shirt that the judge orders somebody to wear that says that they're on probation. I couldn't find any images of this, but it's an interesting one. On the top right, you'll see Felony Friday. And so this is one police department in the state of Texas. And what they do every Friday is they release a mugshot of somebody who's wanted and the crimes that they've committed. And this is normally to kind of catch people that they, I don't know what you call it, they haven't caught, whatever. But this stuff is very popular and it's often publicized and discussed quite widely on social media. So there's an interesting question there about, is such a thing fair? Somebody may have done it wrong. Should the state kind of just be out to simply punish and give a long jail sentence? Should the goal be to shame that person so that it's well known? There's an interesting point here too about the role of a criminal record and the difficulty for people to find work, long after like a jail sentence because of this record. Is this what justice is meant to be about? Or should it be more focused on restoration, on rebalance? Now, this isn't straightforward, and maybe there's some ways in which we can talk about this with, I don't know, smaller crimes like, being drunk or stealing something. Let me just give you one that's a more distressing, and more shocking. So this is, I'm going to bring this up now. This is going to be a harder one to think about. And that's about the Jamie Bulger killers. So I imagine all of you will know about this case in the early 90s of a small boy who was murdered by these two boys. Now it's interesting to think about what the justice system did with this case because there was such a huge amount of public outcry. Now the laws of the time would have meant that, the justice system time would have meant that it wouldn't have been acceptable to give these two boys an indefinite jail sentence. The sentence would have been not long, but not it would have been relatively short. Because of public outrage, the justice system has changed in this case. So their sentences were doubled. And also the minimum age for receiving an indefinite jail sentence was also lowered. For these two in this case, there was a sense in which the justice system needed to show that it was being tough on these two boys. And there's an interesting thing here, and I think Nussbaum, which doesn't give this as an example, but we should keep this in mind, about why the justice system needs to be seen to be tough. And this also comes up when we think about pressures to bring back the death sentence for particularly horrific crimes, which do come up time and again. Of course, when it came to the Bulger killers, there was a difficult thing about the expense involved in giving the two boys who became men new identities when they were released from prison, and the expense of this form of protection which still exists. And there is a lot of outcry. There has been a lot of petitions. And I think it might be the father of Jamie Bulger has kind of has been very active in trying to use every legal measure to have their new identities revealed so that it's known who these two men are, so that they can be, well, I don't know, so that the public are protected. But we do know what that also means. It means that they're going to be very vulnerable to vigilante attacks. So what does the legal system do in this case? This is disquieting and difficult stuff. So I want us to move on to something that's related but slightly different. I want us to think about this, a difference between the concept of shame and the concept of guilt. Now, is there a difference? Is there a difference between being guilty and feeling shame or being ashamed? Now, interestingly, there is. Well, maybe there is. I want you to think about it, and what I want you to do over this kind of next few moments is just think how you would define the two. So I was interested in this, and I started looking up what do people say in probation about this difference, and I found this really interesting piece by I think a young offender, a guy whose name is nicknamed Paul, who writes a report for this, I can't remember what it's called, it's up on Mood, or this kind of centre for social justice and youth work or something. It's a report about the concept of shame in probation and imprisonment. And so Paul is not his real name. He's in prison and he writes this report. It's very good work. And he talks about, what separates the two out. So as Paul says, shame is about a negative general view of yourself broadly, whereas guilt is about remorse for a specific negative behavior that you've done. So you can feel guilty for, let's give an example, like you ran over someone's beloved dog when you were driving. Now, you might feel very guilty, you might be punished for this, for the specific action. But you might also feel a sense of shame. Shame that you might have, this is going to be a hard one, a strange one to bring up, but you might have, or might have had for a long time, like a sense of low self-esteem, or like a narrative that you're not a good person. And so running over this dog would kind of fit back into this narrative, and you might think, well, I only ever do bad things. You would feel a broader sense of shame about yourself. Now, when Paul is writing about guilt versus shame, he says that guilt is easier to accept responsibility for, because you just can feel bad about the action. You can explain the action. You can realize why it's wrong. You were driving carelessly. You don't know how to drive. You might have been drunk driving. This is some way you can, after some time, partition and separate from yourself. But shame is a difficult one, because if it's you yourself that are wrong, that are bad, then what do you do with that? As Paul says, it can lead to a lot of harmful effects. It makes you distance yourself from others. You hide from humanity. You might blame others. You might blame your childhood. You might blame something that happens to you, something traumatic. You might evade responsibility. You might feel bad and then think, fuck it, I don't care. You might also then identify with other miscreants and ne'er-do-wells because you feel rejected, or you feel like you have no place in the broader the broader civilization, the broader human beings that you feel ejected from. So Paul says that actually, if people are feeling a sense of shame, it could actually be counterproductive to justice, because if they're going to identify with negative subcultures, then it's going to increase recidivism. It's going to increase reoffending. Paul asks a broader question here, that when we think about justice and when we think about how we shame people or how we punish them, which of course is a key part of the justice system, and the point here is not that punishment is bad, and Nussbaum's point certainly isn't this, but we need to think about what we're punishing them for and what comes back at the end. This is especially pertinent with prison. So Paul asks, and I'll put this up in front of you, it may then be prudent to ask on a societal level, what kind of person do we want to come back, particularly for young people who stand to face a lifetime defined by an act in their formative years that affixes them to a deviant identity position. But let's just focus on that bit though. What kind of person do we want to come back? What kind of person do we want changed as a result of this intervention in the justice system? And I think this is a good way of thinking about what Martha Nussbaum is trying to do. I mean, this is an interesting book, Hiding from Humanity. It is academic. It's not got the same flow as some of the earlier works, but there is a very interesting question here about what the role of justice is, what the role of any intervention is. All right, so now we're getting on to Nussbaum proper. And we're going to begin here by thinking about what the purpose of shame is for Martha Nussbaum. So let me just say a wee bit about this book itself. So it's written in 2004, and you might be thinking, why did Martha Nussbaum write this? We've been looking at this capability stuff over the last couple of weeks. How did she come back to this? Well, we know that Martha Nussbaum is a very prolific and therefore quite a quick writer. And originally she writes a book review for a book about disgust. And it's out of this kind of lengthy essay review that she becomes interested in this material, and then I think she writes a couple of other essays and does a couple of other talks and kind of crams together this kind of liberal perspective on what disgust means. Anyway, the fundamental question is, what role should shame and disgust have in public life? This is the quote that I gave you early on. And again, Nussbaum is making an interesting point. She is not saying that we should not ever feel shame and disgust. Her point rather is that this is a fundamental part of the human condition. It's a fundamental part of human development. And a new thing in this book is an interest in child psychology. This is present in the references to Donald Winnicott, and it's going to come up later on, actually. It comes up in the book The Monarchy of Fear, which we will talk about probably in a couple of weeks, where she's analysing Donald Trump, and she does it through this kind of analysis of child psychology, of fear and narcissism. So shame and disgust are always present for children. It's part of how we learn, and they're always present for adults. The question is to what extent do we take these real emotions, and they're not, remember for Nussbaum, emotions aren't about, they're not these animal things that we should be ashamed about. Emotions are cognitive, and they reveal dispositions. Instead, we need to understand when we feel shame and disgust for others, what does that then mean in a law and justice context? And can shame even be useful for justice? Now, Nussbaum seems to think it could have a kind of role, and I'll just give you a quote here. Sorry, I should be putting up these slides. That on a basic level, we're going to shame, we're going to punish some people. Some people are worthy of blame. I quote, "It is consistent to hold that the disabled are blameless and therefore should not be shamed while criminals should be." There should be a quotation mark there. That criminals need to be punished for their wrongdoing in some way. They are to be blamed. You know, we're not going to have a world in which negative emotions are removed. But how far do we go with this? And Nussbaum presents these kind of curious and interesting examples about what shame should be used for. And she gives these interesting legal theories who are saying shame is good. Shame, we need this shame. It's a sense of the community's moral values being exhibited and amplified. Etzioni will come back to him in a bit. That shame will promote a revival of our community's common moral sense. Okay. Now that's interesting. We know that Nussbaum is working in a liberal and individualistic framework for good reasons. And one of the things that she talks about in a couple of places in this book is communitarianism. A community's common moral sense. Look at that, Etienne is really hammering that home. Community common. That when we can bandy together, when we kind of say those are the bad people and we are not part of them and we will punish them, and this will be a useful reminder of what we believe, because if we don't punish, if we don't feel a sense of shame, then we lose track of what we've all got in common. Okay. Which all sounds all right, doesn't it? Or maybe not. We've got to think about what it means to point the finger and what it means to blame. And this has a very interesting historical context, which has just occurred to me now, so it's not on the slides. When we think about witch crazes, when we think about scapegoating, when we think about the ways in which one or two members of a community decide that the cause of our ills is this group of people over here. When we think about the witch craze, what I mean here is the identification and punishment of witches, in inverted commas, in the early modern period. This came about during a time of famine and environmental instability. It's called the Little Ice Age, where there's a lot of crop failure. So if we're going to punish usually these kind of poorer older women for the crops failing by blaming them bad intervention, then this could be quite risky, because it's all about who points the finger, isn't it? We might think of Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general, roaming around Essex and Suffolk in the 1660s. So Etzioni is talking about reviving our community's common moral sense. But there's a risk here about the power of people whipping up superstition and fear. But maybe that's just part of any moral society, that we need to make judgments about what is right and wrong. We do this. They may not be universal, they may be specific to our culture, but there is in every society a moral majority, a silent majority, and we need to speak for them. Nussbaum gives an example from Lord Devlin, who talks about how we come up with, how we kind of respect the average morality for culture. And it relates to being on the bus in Clapham. That what we need to do is think about the the morality of the average man on the Clapham omnibus. I think is an interesting and wonderful formulation. Yeah, the man on the Clapham omnibus. Now, this is curious. So what does that mean? So Devlin here is the late 19th century, and he's saying, well, when we think about a sense of justice, we need to keep in mind here how we imagine what the average person thinks. We need to kind of protect this, as in, we might not think that the action in question is wrong, but if it's going to outrage our peers, who maybe aren't as civilized, aren't as refined as us, then we still need to protect that. Now, the context here is homosexuality. For lawmakers back then, they might decide that there's nothing wrong about sexual practices among consenting adults, but we need to kind of speak and protect the prejudices of the population. I guess an attitude like Lord Devlin's is inherently conservative. That law preserves, it protects, it's not going to provision for a more liberal and more progressive future. Okay. We're probably immediately thinking of all sorts of problems with this. Let's just keep with Nussbaum for a moment, and then I'm going to set you a question, and this is going to be the discussion topic as well. So Nussbaum in his introduction is talking about what law should do, how it should be. So in contrast to all of these circulating powerful feelings and emotions, Nussbaum asks, and it's a good question, maybe law and lawmakers should skip all this Clapham omnibus stuff. Maybe they should strive to provide law which is completely emotion-free, where we take out and we try to disarm and diffuse and remove people's anger, where there should be no, where it's almost wrong, it's bad to feel anything when we punish. We must be completely cold and impartial. Now, you know what? I think this is quite a good argument to take, but it's not the argument that Nussbaum makes. She says, and we can think about this in terms of how it fits in with her previous work, that the law shouldn't be emotion-free. Because she doesn't think that we should be emotion-free because we can't. That is to strive to be like gems, it's to strive to be like gods, and it's just not going to work. Anger in particular, and this is going to be our topic next week, is not something that we can ever really get rid of, but also Nussbaum makes an interesting point that anger is actually quite a good thing in its own way. It's a reasonable type of emotion to have, because in general we get angry when we lose a good or that we care about, or when something that we care about is harmed, which is inevitable. So we inevitably experience anger. So why should we not feel angry when somebody runs over our dog, when somebody harms us, or somebody robs us? To say that we shouldn't feel in that situation is wrong. Maybe it's patronizing. But some emotions are more equal than others. Jealousy, Nussbaum says, is not a good emotion to have in the justice system. Why is that? Well, she's thinking here about the underlying disposition or the ideas or the worldview, we could say, that the emotion contains. And as far as Nussbaum sees it, jealousy, and it's an interesting definition, is about wanting to totally control somebody. That we're jealous of someone, or we're jealous of somebody's relationship with someone, and we want to have complete control and management of this. Now, this isn't possible, nor is this reasonable. The same goes with disgust, and we'll talk about disgust in a little bit. Disgust is not a reasonable emotion to have in law, even if it is in person, because there's something about disgust which is a striving for purity. It's to point the finger and say, that thing is disgusting. That thing is not like us. That thing is animal. That thing is horrible. That thing is toxic. And we are pure. And it's this aspiration for purity and this pointing the finger at impurity, which is what bothers Nussbaum. Now, there's another definition that comes up, and some of the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted this. Nussbaum seems to imply in the introduction that she's going to talk about different examples of shame, different types. But in the end, she only really gives one type, and that's what she calls primitive shame. But when she gives this account of primitive shame, what she's really giving here is just a really good definition of how she views shame. Now, primitive implies kind of primitive man and primitive peoples, but I think a better way of thinking about this is like our own basic sense of shame in us as human beings. Now I'm going to put this up in front of you, and we'll go through this bit by bit because it's a bit of a long formulation, but it's a very interesting one. And there's something here that I think we'll talk about this with Donald Trump in a moment. So Nussbaum is talking about how she defines primitive shame. And she says that it is, quote, a shame closely connected to an infantile demand for omnipotence and the unwillingness to accept neediness. Now notice what she then does. She's presenting her argument quite quickly here, but this is such an important passage. Now this form of shame is, back to the quote, like disgust, a way of hiding from our humanity. Why is it hiding from our humanity? Well, we can get this from the previous formulation. That there's something about being human which is to be fundamentally needy. It is to not be omnipotent. We wish to be omnipotent, but we can't be. Our fragility. The stuff from Rousseau at the very beginning. So this is a way of hiding from our humanity that is both irrational in a normative sense, well, in a kind of prescriptive sense, that we embody and wish to be a type of creature one is not. In other words, it's unrealistic in general to strive to be a kind of human being that we cannot be. We are the human animal, after all. But Nussbaum also says that it's unreliable in a practical sense, because it's frequently bound up with narcissism and an unwillingness to recognise the rights and needs of others. Okay, she's now added on some more bits here. Nussbaum's normally quite a good writer, but this is, I would call this French-style prose, a super long, dense sentence. Now, why would it be narcissistic to have a sense of primitive shame? Well, there's narcissism in supposing that we are omnipotent and we are perfect, that we are without blemishes. There's a narcissism in finding complete satisfaction in love in contemplating ourselves. I know it seems absurd, but this is what goes back to the child's sense of needing and wanting everything and not really. Well, it's interesting, when in the monarchy of fear, Nussbaum talks about Trump as being deeply narcissistic, but also deeply afraid. That this kind of narcissism involves a fear because we are vulnerable, because we could be hurt. And in fact, this vulnerability is a kind of deep pain in our psyches, in our hearts, a pain that we wish to be free of. So we build a shield and we look within. Now, the unwillingness to recognise the rights and needs of others is another thing that's almost kind of separate from the narcissism. Nussbaum seems to be making a point here about politics. That there's something about being able to recognise our vulnerability, which means that we can see ourselves as equals and peers to others who are also fragile and vulnerable and imperfect like us. That if we believe that we're perfect, then we're not going to recognise others as our equals, because they're going to frustrate us or let us down in different ways. This goes back to that lovely formulation that some of you will know in Hannah Arendt, that the goal of philosophy is to cultivate an enlarged mentality. We need to be aware of our own weaknesses for this. Okay, so if we were in class, this is where I'll be saying, right, we're going to have a cup of tea in a minute, and already it's probably 2:15, and you're thinking, right, this class is going to finish quite soon. But this is where I set you some questions, and what we're going to do instead here is I've put something up on the Moodle that I want you to post a response to. Oh, I've messed up the animation for this. So broadly, the argument of hiding from humanity, the goal, is to provide a liberal account for the dangers of using shame and disgust in law. Now, this quote here from page 16 is absolutely amazing. We're going to just zoom in on 2 words. You might have spotted them already. Political equality must be sustained by an emotional development that understands humanity as a condition of shared incompleteness. Now, that's a really nice formulation for the stuff that Nussbaum has already set out earlier. About our fragility, about our need for others, shared incompleteness. Anyway, what I'd like to do on the discussion forums, once you've had to listen to this, and I think, is tell everyone else, what do you make of that argument, and of the argument broadly of the book that we get in the introduction, How does Nussbaum come to argue this? What is she using to make this argument? And does it remind you of anything else, any other previous concepts on this course? And so my suggestion, because this is a bit broad, is maybe on the discussion forum you could try and answer one of these questions. And then, just so we can see if we can, let's see if we can get this discussion forum to work, because I think it might be easier than trying to get us all to call into like a group Skype thing. Is once you've posted something, my suggestion is to come back to the forum in about 12 hours or a day's time and see if anyone else has posted anything. And then off those posts, choose one that most speaks to you and then reply to it. Also, see if anyone has replied to your posts and then maybe reply to that. So there's these kind of two follow-up things. And I think if we try and do this, we can then get a conversation going on a discussion forum, because otherwise we might all post a long message or like a little thought piece or something, but then it's just all isolated. So see if you can also add a response. So sharing completeness. I'm still here. I just wanted to give you a moment to think about this. Right, what we're going to do now is, because I can't hear you all talking and telling me what you think, I'm going to move on a little bit, and I want us to think about the broader political context and agenda of this book, which I think is very interesting. And it's interesting to think about how Nussbaum is trying to solve problems here. She explicitly here, and in last week's work, Creating Capabilities, is presenting herself as a liberal thinker, as a liberal internationalist thinker. And when you look on Wikipedia at the breadth of subjects that Nussbaum writes about, it's very broad. We haven't really covered a lot of them. She writes about animal rights and patriotism, aging, lots of other things. And in each case, my impression is that she is trying to provide, it's a kind of maybe a perfectionism. She's trying to be complete in addressing all of these different philosophical areas. But she's also, and maybe she feels a sense of vocation about this, trying to provide an up-to-date liberal interpretation of the problem in question. So here it's about shame and disgust. And what does a liberal political outlook do with shame and disgust? How do we take it from the reactionary right? How does the centre left use these concepts? Now, this book kind of gives a couple of interesting answers on this, and this is also in the introduction. And what makes Nussbaum interesting is the normativity, I should say. She is not saying that liberalism is about tolerating any old crap. Liberalism is not like this. Liberalism has to embody and teach a certain set of norms. It wants to produce a certain kind of citizenship. Now, this comes up in a couple of interesting passages here about the role of institutions. Now, it's interesting to think about because when we do think about liberalism, we might think of something a bit more like British liberalism in practice, which is kind of everyone pays taxes and works, and we don't ask any questions as long as the economy is fine. Okay, but Nussbaum's liberalism is slightly stricter, and it comes up towards in a most recent work in the Monarchy of Fear, where some of you might know this because we talked about this some of you in a previous course about her ideas of national service. How would this work in practice? Everybody would not want to do this, all these 17, 18-year-olds. But Nussbaum is trying to make a point here that the liberal state needs to have norms that it teaches, and this comes up here. Institutions must be sustained by the goodwill of citizens. Okay. But they also embody and teach norms of what a good and reasonable citizen is. They are sustained by the psychology of real people. Notice that Nussbaum is actually she's balancing 2 points here. She presents a commonsensical view, popular psychology, the feeling, public spirit, but then she's saying that the institutions must train, they must teach. In a way, think about capability approach and how it raises the threshold. The institutions must also embody, teach, and express a political psychology through norms of the reasonable citizens and the proper role for law. My argument in this book is what sort of public and legal culture will embody the political psychology appropriate to a liberal regime. Now that's interesting. Maybe we haven't talked about that much on this course yet, but partly because I've wanted to stay away from political topics. I'm sorry. But Nussbaum is maybe pushing us into a corner here. What should liberal institutions do? Now, this has a big basis on education. And when we had our class on Monday, we did talk a lot about schooling, actually, I think at this point or shortly before. But this might be something that you might want to think about. Now, something else then comes up shortly after, and there's something where we get a bit of Immanuel Kant speaking through Martha Nussbaum, when she talks about what a society should set out to do. And Nussbaum says a society should have these visions or these norms that it strives to achieve, but it may not achieve them. They're a kind of horizon in the distance that we walk towards. In the terms of Immanuel Kant, these are called regulative ideals. Regulative ideals. These are ideas that almost compel us to be more ambitious in our moral behaviour. We may not be perfect, we may not never lie, but we might lie a bit less if we think about the harmful things that take the harmful consequences of lying, but also the deep wrong of not telling people the truth. Martha Nussbaum. What I'm calling for, in effect, is something that I do not expect we shall ever fully achieve. Now that's interesting, because there's a deep pragmatism in the work that we've seen previously, the capabilities approach. She's not trying to be too normative there, but here she is. And maybe that's because this book is really directed at the United States rather than the kind of global UN development audience. Now this is interesting. What Nussbaum is calling for is a society that acknowledges its own humanity and neither hides us from it nor it from us. A society of citizens who admit that they are needy and vulnerable and who discard the grandiose demands for omnipotence and completeness that have been at the heart of so much human misery, both public and private. So maybe when we think here about justice, when we think about fat shaming or flight shaming or class shaming or any shaming, coronavirus shaming, there's a kind of call here for a sort of modesty. By us ourselves recognizing our incompleteness, recognizing our inability to be morally perfect and flawless, because we can't, to see ourselves as fundamentally compromised, but not compromised as a fallen state, but as a deeply human state. Rather than this being a basis of pessimism, this is a basis for a clear liberal politics in which we can actually face each other, we can actually work together, and we can actually respect each other, and we can befriend and cooperate with each other, because none of us are perfect, all of us are fragile and vulnerable. And what Nussbaum wants us to do is have this as a basic psychological position so that we can then freely cooperate. I think there's a lot in that view. Let's move on to disgust and what disgust means for Nussbaum's account and what it means historically. Now, I want you to think about disgust and what is disgusting. You probably don't. Why do we want to think about what's disgusting? We might immediately think of things that are about our own bodies that happen every day, throughout the day, but are kind of shameful and that are not to be publicly disclosed. But also with disgust, there's something different. And Nussbaum's point is we have that basic sense of revulsion, but then this then becomes tied in our social ideas to social groups that are also considered to be animalistic, to be dangerous, to be impure, to be dirty. Now, have a think about some historical examples of people that have been scapegoated as disgusting, as subhuman, as untouchable. Now, of course, by using the phrase untouchable, you might have begun thinking about the Indian caste system. Let me use one that we'll also all be familiar with, depressingly, but some of you that did the Hannah Arendt class will remember, which is the example of anti-Semitism. And there are some images in front of you of medieval and early modern anti-Semitism, because we're going to just use this as a quick context for thinking about disgust more broadly. So Jewish people were expelled from England for about 400 years. They were readmitted during the time of Oliver Cromwell in the 1660s. The image on the left, a Jew of Colchester. The one on the right is German. And the one in the middle, this is an image of Jewish money lenders. So they look like kind of biscuits, but this isn't meant to be coins. So the sense of revulsion that medieval and early modern Christians often felt for Jews and what they were about. We know that Jewish people were forced to live in ghettos. I kind of think ghetto comes from Venice. I think it's a part of Venice. Into communities, that they were associated with certain trades that were forbidden to Christians, and then they were seen as quite quickly as, not quickly, but they were seen historically as ethnically different, but also at the same time that they were kind of dangerous, that they were not equals at all. So let's just, well, actually, I should have put the F1 straight up. Here are some more images. Now this is about the blood libel and the history of the idea that Jewish people have conspired to kill Christian children and drink their blood, or kind of corrupt the host, you know, the kind of the blood, the wine, and the bread and the wine, the body and blood of Christ. What does that mean for disgust? So when Nussbaum, she does give the example of anti-Semitism, when we think about disgust, it comes out of this demand to be pure, that we are good and they are bad. Now Nussbaum says that disgust is always deeply irrational because of this idea that we can be immortal, that we can be non-animal. That what we do is we take these animal functions. When we think about the untouchables in India, they are people that are, you know, associated with kind of removing waste. We project what is a deep part of ourselves in our world, what is intimate to us, and then we project it onto other human beings, and we say that they're the sick ones, they're the bad ones, they're the dirty ones. So Nussbaum says that the problem with disgust is that it embodies magical ideas of contamination, impossible aspirations to purity, immortality, and non-animality. Now they're just not realistic because we are animal, we are impure, if that makes, whatever that means, we are mortal. Now we are, as human beings, from our earliest child development, we're conditioned to want to conceal these human and animal functions. And then our societies are kind of organized around that. You know, the way that we deal with our own waste is kind of flushed away, and it's a very discreet and hidden thing. Our familiarity with death, which sadly, which I don't know, which, you know, in recent times at least, we don't have the same customs that our ancestors did, you know, around preparing people after they die. That death is something that is hidden away that we don't see. So Nussbaum says that most societies teach the avoidance of certain groups of people as physically disgusting because these roles of dealing with these wasteful and shameful things are kind of partitioned, they're hidden away, and they're usually given to kind of lower class people. So disgust is something that we project outwards. So it's weird, Nussbaum says, it's weird that you've got these legal theorists who are saying that disgust is actually quite good. That actually a good justice system needs to take this psychological condition and use it as a basis for lawmaking. That's not right. But let's just think about the arguments. We had Etzioni much earlier. So Leon Kass is something that Nussbaum mentions. He is a bioethicist, I think, working under George Bush's regime, which, well, you know, was horrifying back in the early 2000s, but, you know, compared to Trump now, Jesus. Leon Kass. So he is somebody who's saying that disgust is a good thing. The wisdom of repugnance. Disgust may be the only voice left that speaks up to defend the central core of our humanity. Now, I think in this context, he's talking about gene editing, about these certain things that we sense are boundaries that we shouldn't overstep. But let's think about the risk here. When we think about disgust, and where disgust leads to scapegoating, and what that revulsion means, that when we're revolted by certain groups, it's not just that we think, oh, that revulsion is often accompanied by hatred and persecution and anger. So Dan Khan, somebody who Nussbaum mentions him in the acknowledgements and says that, you know, she wrote to him quite a lot and he helped with the book, but she often disagrees with him. He's a progressive lawmaker, he's not conservative. And he says that we need disgust because it helps us see what cruelty is. Okay. But is that really safe? So Etzioni gives this example, it's an interesting one, of how disgust and shaming could be a useful thing for putting off people from reoffending. And he says what should happen to young kids on the streets, on the corners, when they're first caught selling drugs, is that their hair should be shaved, And their pants, they should be taken off them. They should be forced to walk home. It's American style pants, I assume, and humiliated in this way. And this humiliation will train them. It will train them to not do this again. They will be shamed. Maybe there'll be a sense of disgust, although this is more shame. And this will be useful both for them and the community to kind of inhibit wrongdoing. It's interesting to think here in a slightly different way about the internal sense of shame and disgust, of when we are ashamed of ourselves, or when we're disgusted at ourselves. Now, it's hard to probably immediately think of an example of this, because maybe there's something about our own psychological processes that screen out these things so that we don't feel shame and disgust. We don't want to think about ourselves in this way. But there might be past lives when we have felt a deep sense of disgust with something that we've done. And what does that then mean? How do we come back from that? Do we just kind of build a wall around it? Do we just think of it as, do we learn to explain the action, or is it something different? Nussbaum says, and this is kind of later on in this book, that we need to move on from disgust, but not always in a really rational direction. She gives the example, it's an interesting one, of Nazism in German writing. That what happened for First World War veterans living and fighting in the trenches where they were surrounded at different points by human corpses, is that you get in their writing this kind of increased sense, this visceral sense of disgust at the human body. This disgust at this kind of, and this is looked at, this is kind of explored in a psychoanalytical way, at oozing, at slime, at hair, at skin. Now she uses one writer, Ernst Junger, who talks about he's looking at war. He's kind of looking at these soldiers running across no man's land, and he imagines in them that these soldiers don't have human bodies. They have bodies that are like they're made of steel or metal, and they are pure points of energy that they've left behind in shameful human body. Now, Klaus Tevelight has written a great book called Male Fantasies. I think this is in the late 80s or 90s, where he looked at Freikorps writings and how this kind of striving to leave behind the disgusting animal body was also involved a deep misogyny. So he makes this very interesting point between fascism and misogyny, disgust at women. And this is a really interesting point. I don't know if we'll ever come back to this on this course. So this is what Nussbaum is trying to strive against. She thinks that disgust goes in very worrying directions. It denies our humanity, and it ends up leading us to strive for a condition of invulnerability and perfection, which is deeply dangerous and is premised on a kind of hate and revulsion. So we've got to fight against this. This is something from the conclusion of this book. If ideals of respect and reciprocity are to have a chance of prevailing, they must contend against the forces of narcissism and misanthropy that these emotions so frequently evolve. So where do we go? Now I'm just going to cover briefly, I realize this talk has lasted way more than 20 minutes, the conclusion of this book. So where is Nussbaum trying to get to? What she's ultimately trying to argue? And there's some interesting things here that we can just highlight about what the liberal society and the norms and the institutions that it wants to transmit, what it should do with what is being kind of outlined. And I'll read this to you. More generally, by reflecting on the deep difficulties in human life that prompt the reliance on disgust and shame as public sentiments, we have begun to see at least the outlines of some capacities that a liberal society should cherish and further develop. Now, what are these capacities? Now, you Nussbaum scholars have a guess. What are the capacities, and what are the key words that Nussbaum always comes back to? Well, we can almost try a form of bingo here, and you can see if you get this right. Well, the first one is new. The ability to enjoy relations of interdependence rather than domination. Great. The ability to acknowledge incompleteness from earlier, animality and mortality in oneself and in others. So this is about fragility, isn't it? This is about our vulnerability. Now we know that Nussbaum has a kind of political turn, which I think comes about through the global economic development work. And this is a big feature for the most recent writing. So what it also involves is public education and the general crafting of public institutions and a public culture. And through this, Nussbaum says, a society can do much to encourage these capacities and discourage those that lead to unequal and hierarchical social relations. So there's some interesting things here to kind of reflect on. Nussbaum is moving towards a position of political egalitarianism. Now we can put it in the context, it's about liberalism, it's about individualism, but that's not about egoism. It's not laissez-faire, everyone does what they want as long as they pay taxes. It involves norms about how we should be. And in a justice sense, involves us being vulnerable and incomplete. It's about us being animal. We're human animals. We can't be immortal. Now, is there anybody that we can think of who doesn't live up to those ideals? Yep, you know where I'm going, don't you? This guy. Now, Nussbaum doesn't know what's lying ahead, does she? Nor did we in 2004. Now, there's a really interesting piece in the online magazine New Republic about the politics of disgust. And it brings to light some interesting research that you might find interesting. Now, this piece is written before Donald Trump is elected as president. So really it's focusing on, well, I think it's before he's president, it's focusing on why he's become so popular as a Republican candidate. Well, when we think about Trump, we think about somebody who's shameless, who doesn't ever acknowledge anything that he's done wrong, who constantly lies and brags. But what New Republic also say is that what seems to have helped him become so popular is the way that his rhetoric very often involves disgust at minorities and women. It very often dehumanizes them. Now, bigotry and disgust are nothing new. Maybe they're features that we get among fruitcakes in many different societies. But the problem, and this is the problem not so much of Trump, but for the United States, is that this stuff has resonated and has been very popular with a large core of conservative voters. And this is what the piece ends up talking about, that actually disgust being more sensitive to disgust means that you're more likely to have a right-wing political outlook. I'll explain this in a second. Anyway, the piece brings some evidence of Trump. I mean, I'm sorry to have a slide with some Trump quotes, using a rhetoric of disgust to resonate with voters. And you might be thinking here, a lot of this is going to be about Mexico, about the countries of Latin America, and yeah, about where the drug dealers are coming from. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East. The US has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. We're probably thinking here of the shithole countries. This phrase comes later, not when this piece was written. People are pouring across the southern border. I will build a wall. It will be a great wall. People will not come in unless they come in legally. Drugs will not pour through that wall. Now let's think about walls. A wall that cannot be breached. In some ways, that's almost like what Nussbaum is saying about hiding away our animality, about putting up a shield and projecting a sense of invincibility, which isn't possible. Trump's Iran deal was also described as disgusting. There's loads of examples, I think, where Trump is describing usually ethnic minorities as these kind of dangerous parasites, as things that will corrupt and contaminate. And come on, we know that the UK isn't free of this either. They often have the rhetoric of migrants swamping. I think it's Margaret Thatcher used this phrase, originally swamping the UK. But what swamps? What swarms? We're not talking about human beings, we're talking about insects. And the idea of a swamp itself, the swamp is a place that is kind of disgusting and malarial and dangerous. Anyway, this New Republic piece draws attention to this journal article by a range of authors. You can see it in front of you, where, this is an interesting one, between disgust, sensitivity and political conservatism. They use a sample of over 120 countries, and this is what they spot. And here is a graph. So we'll see very liberal to very conservative, and then disgust sensitivity. So if you're very liberal, your sensitivity to disgust is the lowest, and then it goes up pretty straightforwardly. All right. Now, is that really so straightforward? So this is something that we also debated in our class, and I think we were not so sure about this. Because what is the underlying frame of viewing politics this way? Well, let's look at it in terms of psychological traits. And this has happened with Brexit and it's happened with the Trump vote. That rather than seeing these as the product of political or economic situations or relations, actually they're about personality types. And some of you might know about this research that has been done where these Trump and Brexit have been predicted in terms of an authoritarian personality. So that if you're more in favour of the death penalty, you're more in favour of voting for Trump or Brexit and so on. So it's not about social class, it's not about your economic position, it's about psychology. Now this might seem true on some levels, but enough as it might seem a bit incomplete. Incomplete, I don't know why I can't say this. Because that would then, if this were true, then we would expect fairly kind of predictable and standard political results every time. But we know that politically, the right have really kind of had an upturn. So have our personalities changed? I mean, that doesn't seem very likely. Maybe there are other social and economic factors, thinking about Brexit or thinking about Johnson's landslide at the end of last year. So I think we should be a bit wary of this. Okay, we're getting there, I promise. So this is pretty much our last slide. An image of the world as mosaics. And I've chosen this because to me it represents the concept of cosmopolitanism. That maybe there's something about a politics of disgust and shame in which we shield ourselves from others and other groups and other cultures. We build a wall, we leave unions, we build up fences and we hide ourselves. Now, when we hide ourselves, we project an image of our own invincibility, but it's a deluded one. And we'll soon be kind of hit with the reality of this in due course. And then who do we blame for that humiliation? Surely a better route is to kind of recognize our weaknesses, our modesty, our incompleteness in the first place. So I'm going to end with two quotes from Martha Nussbaum in two different places. So what makes this work really interesting is what it's meant to do. Nussbaum says, if we leave out all the emotional responses that connect us to this world of what the Stoics call external goods, we leave out a great part of our humanity, and the part that lies at the heart of explaining why we have civil and criminal laws and what shape they take. We cannot and we must not cut ourselves off from others, and that's part of what's there in that Rousseau quote. That's part of what's there in being a vine and being a plant. You rely on others, you need others. There's also something quite wonderful in that Bill Moyers interview that we looked at the very beginning of this course. It's when you are trying to live well and you deeply care about the things you're trying to do, but the world enters in a particularly painful way. And it's in that struggle with recalcitrant circumstances that a lot of the value of the moral life comes in. We're all under so much pressures and stresses at the moment. And again, I'm thinking of all of you at the moment, and I hope you and your loved ones are well. Part of our vulnerability, part of our neediness, part of our fragility. At times like these, it's this fragility that can scare us. And it's out of necessity that we are building walls and that we are hiding ourselves from others, and we have to do this. But all of us are doing this, and all of us are scared, and all of us are worried. And in that way, we're all sharing in a shared incompleteness. And it's because of this fragility, because of this neediness, because of this not being able to be with our loved ones now at the moment, for some time it seems, that we realise how valuable they are and how much we love them and how much we need them. And it's that love and that value that has made our lives so good up until this point now. Okay. All right, so how are we going to do this going forward? So what I would like you to do, once you've had a listen, is see if you can address those questions. We'll do this as an online discussion. What I'm going to try and do is record next Monday's class on probably Sunday, I think. I'm going to put it up on Moodle on Sunday, and I'm going to send you all an email. And what I will try and do, I think, is set up a discussion forum again. But I'm going to see if we can try and do an online dial-in using this program called Zoom. Now, Zoom is something that you don't need to sign up for, and it's completely free. But it will cap our session at 40 minutes. But 40 minutes might be enough for a discussion. So maybe let's say provisionally now, if you can keep 1 o'clock next Monday free, and we'll try and do this, and I'll try and set an online discussion before. So the reading, which I think is on Moodle now actually, is from quite a recent book by Martha Nussbaum, the 2016 Anger and Forgiveness, and it's really good. The writing is really good. Like, if you've been thinking Nussbaum, oh, it's gone a bit downhill, I think this is a return to form. I want you to look at chapter 2, and we're going to discuss it. Let's see how it works. All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you're all well, and yeah, hopefully we'll speak together next Monday at 1 o'clock. All right, thanks very much everyone.